Great. Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone to this. I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion with FCC Chairman Ajit Pai. So let me first introduce him, and then we'll move on to some questions before we get on to the questions from the group. I know he's a very familiar face, but just as background for everyone, Ajit Pai is the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. He was designated as such by President Donald Trump in January of 2017. He had previously served as commissioner at the FCC, appointed by then President Barack Obama, and unanimously affirmed by the Senate in May of 2012. As a regulator, Ajit Pai's philosophy is informed by a few simple principles. He espouses that the rules that reflect these principles will result in more innovation, more investment, better products and services, lower prices, more job creation, and faster economic growth. Prior to joining the FCC, Ajit Pai served as a lawyer and general counsel in the telecommunications industry and the U.S. Senate. Chairman Pai graduated with honors from Harvard University in 1994 and from the University of Chicago Law School in 1997, where he was the editor of the University of Chicago Law Review and won the Thomas L. Mulroy Prize. So welcome, and we appreciate very much, I know you're very busy, your time today on this topic. So thank you very much for joining us.
So good to be with you, Bill. Thanks so much to you and InterDigital for giving me this opportunity, and look forward to a good exchange of views.
Great. So I thought I'd start with just kind of getting folks grounded. And again, I think the perspective we want to ultimately get to is maybe how the FCC's role will change as technology moves on, right? But let's first get grounded on 5G. So, how would you describe the current state of play for 5G in the United States and elsewhere?
Certainly here in the United States, I think the state of play is quite strong. From the FCC's perspective, at least, we have been busy for the last couple of years executing what we call the 5G FAST plan, a comprehensive strategy to facilitate America's superiority in 5G technologies. You can get a lot more information about this at fcc.gov/5G, but in a nutshell, that plan has three basic parts: getting more spectrum into the commercial marketplace, making it easier to deploy the wireless infrastructure of the future, in particular small cells, and modernizing our regulations to promote fiber deployment for backhaul. And on each of those three different parts of the plan, we've been really aggressively executing. Obviously, we've had a number of spectrum auctions: 28, 24, 37, 39, 47 gigahertz on millimeter wave. Just finished the CBRS auction, 3.5 gigahertz. Have upcoming the C-band auction on December 8th, a 280 megahertz swath of spectrum for 5G. Next year, we'll be looking to the 2.5 gigahertz band, as well as possibly a 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz auction. So we've got a lot of spectrum in the pipeline, and that's just on the licensed side. Unlicensed, obviously, we freed up the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed use, a whole 1,200 megahertz of it. So spectrum-wise alone, we've been going gangbusters. The same thing with wireless infrastructure. 7,000 small cells in the United States. When I came into office, we're now at 87,000, with 46,000 of those deployed just last year alone. And that's part of one of the reasons why is our streamlining, which was upheld by a key appeals court recently, just making it easier so that state and local governments don't slow the process down, extract exorbitant costs and the like. And fiber deployment, I mean, the results speak for themselves. We set a record for fiber deployment in the United States in 2018, a record that was only broken in 2019. So there too, I think the indicators are good. And I think the thing is really impressive is that, yes, we're executing on the 5G fast plan, but the private sector too is really stepping up to the plate and delivering. We now see major carriers establishing 5G networks. T-Mobile in particular has used some of its low and mid-band assets to activate networks, 5G networks in parts of the country that cover approximately 200 million Americans. And of course, as everybody probably knows, the Apple iPhone 12 just came out, the first feature phone like that with 5G capabilities. So here in the US, I think the forecast is pretty strong, and I'm really excited about where we are and where we're going. But there's no question that other parts of the world too are looking to seize the mantle of 5G leadership as well. And so we always keep an eye on them too. China, South Korea, Japan, Europe. There are many different parts of the world that, of course, are looking to plow ahead also.
Terrific. So, as the systems are now being deployed, I have the benefit of having been in this industry since 1996, and 5G was very unique, right? In that it was the first time the industry was going to attack multiple use cases at once. Maybe at first it was, digital voice, and it was, data, and then big data, kind of one thing at a time. This was, we were going to, further enhance mobile broadband. We were going to enable IoT. We were going to drive mission critical things like autonomous vehicles and things like that. So, looking at how it's being deployed and how it was developed, do you think the industry did its job? Did it come up a little short? Did it actually do better than you think in terms of that really revolutionary technology that they were meaning to deploy?
That's a good question. So I still think that we're in the early stages. To use a baseball analogy, maybe the end of the first or beginning of the second inning. So as I said, we're still really aggressively pushing out a lot of spectrum assets that companies have yet to use or yet to access for 5G technologies. But I think the early signs are pretty promising in terms of some of the use cases. We're already seeing companies using the 5G platform, for example, to think about the telehealth or connected care, essentially. And the IoT, of course, is going to be critical to that. In addition to that, we also see people in the remote learning space. Of course, COVID has accelerated the need for those types of connected technologies. And in areas that you wouldn't necessarily expect, I actually think we're going to see some very interesting use cases. For example, agriculture. Precision agriculture is increasingly the norm on America's farms and ranches, and I've had a chance to visit some of them, from a corn farm in Virginia to a ranch out in Colorado. And many times what you see when you look at a farm is not just the stalks of the grain or whatever, but it's also a big field of data. I mean, they need to upload that to the cloud and have almost symmetrical download speeds as well. And so that's a perfect use case, I think, for 5G technologies. A cloud-based 5G network could address some of those. So I'm really excited to see where this goes, and also the deployment of adjacent technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the like. I think 5G will pop, but it's too soon to say at this point exactly how, where, or when.
Right. Yeah, and in that regard, I'm reminded a little bit of when 3G first rolled out. It was what we were looking for back then was the killer app. Like, what was the thing? And it was interesting, and I kind of feel the same way. That this is 5G. We're the technologists. We're sort of the plumbers. We put out the plumbing, and then you watch to see how the industry accesses that, and they will do it in ways that you thought of, and then in ways you never thought of, right?
Exactly.
So when you look at that, and I think you already mentioned a couple of years ago, agriculture, things that we hadn't really hadn't thought about. There are a couple of things that 5G did. With softwareization, virtualization, and networks, it creates a different competitive environment. You could see incumbents that may struggle because there's new folks that can come in and operate better in that environment. And the person who develops that compelling use case may, just like, Apple, they were the ones that actually they were the ones that came up with the compelling use case on 3G and 4G with the phone. How do you see that? Do you see the incumbents changing here? Do you see this as one of those moments in time where we could actually see all new people flowing into this market and other people moving out because they're not able to compete?
That's a really good question. So I do think so. I mean, I think that for those of you who are watching, who remember Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, I mean, it's very much a situation, I think, where if the incumbents aren't thinking ahead about how to change the nature of their networks, the nature of the services they provide over those networks, then there are many other new competitors who are entering the space. And so a good example of that is our recent CBRS auction. I mean, traditionally, when the FCC held a spectrum auction, it was pretty cut and dried. Okay, wireless carrier is going to come bid at the auction. They'll use it for wireless services. But here, the CBRS auction, which just closed recently, you saw cable companies, electric utilities, and others looking to buy the spectrum with an eye to creating either an adjunct, in the case of cable companies, we expect an adjunct to their fixed broadband networks to extend the reach where fiber penetration is just impractical as an economic matter, or for the electric utilities, creating a bespoke 5G network that allows them to optimize the way they manage the power grid, and others too. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about 5G is that it's not just the nature of the services that are changing, it's the nature of the network themselves. I mean, through network slicing and other types of things, it's almost as if you're able to optimize the network for the benefit of the user, as opposed to the user just having to take either option A or option B, which is based on a preset network architecture. And so I actually think that the incumbents are going to have to really think hard and compete hard in the 5G environment, especially those who have incumbent 5G, 4G, and predecessor architecture. They'll have to deploy the small cells. They'll have to think about softwareization, which is a great point. The FCC recently held a forum on open radio access networks, and the consensus that came out of there is that this technology is not just abstract, it's real, it is now, and it offers savings in terms of costs, puts the keys to security in the hands of the network operator, and in particular for those standalone operators like Geo in India and others around the world, it creates an advantage actually, because you don't have to be saddled with some of the limitations or constraints of the legacy architecture. So the incumbents are going to have to be agile. They can't just sit on their laurels. And that's a good thing for the consumer at the end of the day. I mean, that's of course who the FCC is looking out for.
Right, right. Yeah, it's the beauty of standardization, right? Because ultimately it brings the best competitors in and creates the best result, and the consumer gets the best price and best service at the end of the day, right? So it's a really compelling story. So go back to something you mentioned before about other countries. So we're seeing obviously there was a significant interest around the world in the development of 5G technology, and you see various countries around the world deploying it. You see fights, geopolitical fights around 5G, like one country or another country. How do you think about that? I mean, I've always felt the competitiveness of standardization, the fact that you had the best engineers from around the world competing head to head was great for the consumer, right? Because they get the best result. And our job is to do the best we can. I think the U.S.'s job is to try to help U.S. industry where it can to be as competitive as they possibly can be. But how do you think about that generally? And do you think the world is on the right path here? Or do we see conflict starting in terms of how various countries are looking at 5G deployment and technology control and things like that?
Well, certainly my hope is, as somebody who believes in free markets and collaboration as opposed to competition, negative competition amongst countries, is that obviously a rising tide raises all boats is the goal of technology. And so I certainly hope when it comes to 5G or other technologies of the future, all of us can collaborate. But the unfortunate reality is that there are some geopolitical considerations here, and in particular with respect to China. We spent a lot of time at the FCC over the last couple of years thinking about the threats that China presents, not just as a rival in the development and deployment of 5G technologies, but also on the security front. And that's why I spent a lot of time in the last year in particular developing the FCC's proposal to ban use of our universal service fund from being spent by US carriers on Huawei and ZTE and other problematic carriers, working with Congress to come up with ways to finance the removal and replacement of 4G and predecessor technologies from Huawei and ZTE. And then also I've spent a lot of time on the road over the last year, but before the pandemic anyway, visiting countries from Bahrain to Brazil, India to Malaysia, just talking about the US vision for 5G security and hearing their concerns as well. And initially, some people questioned, well, what results is that yielding? But now we're starting to see the results. I mean, India, for example, Singapore, just today, I read a story that Sweden has banned on security grounds the use of Huawei and ZTE from their 5G networks. And so I think as the importance of 5G to so many parts of our economy and society becomes clear and countries start to make decisions that are right for them, we're starting to see more momentum in favor of the US position of a risk-based framework for 5G security, not singling out any company or country as such, but just evaluating the risk and deciding that certain risks, in particular those from some of the Chinese vendors identified, are simply too much for a country to bear.
Right, right. So it brings me to sort of the next category of topics what you just talked about is, if you went back to 2012 when you joined the FCC and thought about what things they were engaged in at that point in time, and you look at 5G and how it's going to touch not just telecommunications and how we talk to people or how we access the internet, but it's going to control how we how we control cars, how we do autonomous surgery, how we do a whole host of things. How is the FCC's role changing? And I guess part of that would also be, how is if it's not just the FCC, how's the whole U.S. government thinking of? Is there like a point person that kind of pulls together all of the variety of interests and says, okay, our security interests or our interest in 5G is going to be managed in the following way, and they get justice and FCC and a bunch of other people to kind of pull in, because it seems to touch so many aspects of government too, right? So.
Yeah, that's you've put your finger on one of the biggest challenges that I've seen over my time at the FCC, which is that the job has changed substantially. I mean, for example, when I was a commissioner, from 2012 until 2017, getting this job, there were two major spectrum auctions, this incentive auction 600 megahertz and the AWS-3 auction. On each of those auctions, everybody was aligned: Congress, the FCC, all of the agencies. And so it was a relatively smooth process. I mean, some tough political fights here and there, but overall people were aligned. Over the last couple of years, as I said, we've opened up so many different spectrum bands, and each one of them has powerful incumbencies. The Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, you name it. Everybody seems to want to keep some of the spectrum, and there are some non-federal, essentially commercial incumbencies as well, that don't want to have to share or relinquish that spectrum. So in that nature, in that sense, the job has become much more one of a negotiator or a diplomat, if you will, as opposed to a straightforward regulator. So that's been a challenge. The other thing too is the international component to it as well. You've got to be a diplomat on the international stage, trying to harmonize some of these spectrum bands for use. And recently I was on the phone with the Brazilian regulator that's looking up to open up the 6 gigahertz band. Because in the end, what we know is that the more aligned other nations are, the more likely you, of course, you get the economies of scale that will come with equipment development and services. So, regardless of who is at the FCC in the future, I think one thing that's going to be constant is the need for us to constantly think about how do we do this job in a much more complex environment. And that's not even bringing in some of the technologies that we don't regulate, but that impact our jobs: AI, machine learning, blockchain, maybe even quantum in the future. We don't have, as I said, direct regulatory authority, but in the end, that's going to be part of the communications landscape.
And how does that, just for people on the phone, maybe for me too, how do the different agencies communicate and work together on an issue that could cut across, it could cut across, it could go from justice to the patent office to FCC, where it needs to be a balance of those views, and there needs to be almost a single opinion at the end of the day, formed by lots of different inputs. And so how does that work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, there's only one of me, and there are many different alphabet soup agencies, and I just don't have the time to get on the horn every time with every one of them. So what we typically do, and we've made this a practice over the last 3.5 years, certainly, is to put everything that we're doing with respect to spectrum into what is called the Interdepartment Radio Advisory Committee, or IRAC. And so the IRAC is led by the NTIA, which is an agency within the Department of Commerce. And then NTIA farms it out to a bunch of different agencies and says, okay, the FCC is thinking about X, what do you think? And then after a certain period of time, minimum 15 days, but often much more than that, they will come back to us and say, okay, well, we don't agree with X, or we think X is fine, but you should also do Y and Z. And so then we incorporate that feedback as best we can into our proposal or our order. And so that way, when the FCC makes a decision, we're not just speaking on behalf of ourselves, an independent agency, we're independent of the executive branch technically, but also so that we're coordinating amongst the various agencies. And that's exceptionally important. We also, of course, take a lot of account of some of the feedback we get from the public. We open up all of our proposals to the notice and comment process, and that feedback we get from industry is really important as well.
Great. So one thing you mentioned was, obviously FCC very, very important around spectrum usage. There's, I know at InterDigital, we've been working on various spectrum sharing technologies for years, different ways for different people to access the same spectrum, either because there's a database that says it's used or not, or there's sniffing radios that say if there's anything in there or not, or there's other ways to share that spectrum in a way that, because at the end of the day, spectrum is kind of like beachfront property, right? There's only so much. So what's the state of play of that? Do you think this is an area where it's mostly policy that needs to change, or is there real technology needs to make shared spectrum access actually work better and be more secure and things like that? Or is it, my guess it's a little bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, here, I think InterDigital's work is so very important. As you said, they're not making any more beachfront spectrum. So our only option when I look at some of these different bands is either we move the incumbents out and auction it free and clear, or make it unlicensed without any restraints. Very, very unlikely. Or more likely, we have to work with the incumbents, to make sure that if they stay in that band, there's a way for everyone to share use, either in terms of geography or in terms of time. So that we're able to accommodate both uses. And that's where some of the databases are critical, or other sharing technologies. The 3.5 gigahertz band is a good example of that, where we have the SAS, the spectrum access systems that allow us to coordinate uses, as well as the ESC, the environmental sensing capability. And different tools like that are going to be incredibly important. Same thing with the 6 gigahertz band. We're able to, not through a database, but through AFC, automated frequency coordination, to ensure that when an unlicensed user will be outdoors, we're not entrenching upon incumbent interests, electric utilities or public safety or broadcasters or whatever. And indoors as well, we reduce the power level sufficiently so it's not going to cause bleed over that causes interference. And those are the types of things we're going to have to do in the future. I don't know if you're, for those of you out there who are parents, I think parenthood is good training for spectrum policy, because if you've got kids who are fighting over a toy, ultimately the best use is the best outcome in many cases is for them to use it in a way that maximizes each of their value for it to the maximum extent possible. So same thing comes with spectrum. We're going to have to learn how to live well and play in the sandbox cooperatively if we're going to benefit the public interest.
Right, that's great. So I want to go back to a topic from before, and again, think about in terms of what's the FCC's role here. So, we've one of the reasons our devices are so good is that we've had this really, really healthy competition that's taken it from nowhere, 25 years ago to this amazing device, right? Recently, I'd say in the last cycle of technology, it's the first time that I've sensed that the competition may not be as fair as it once was. And by that, I mean, within the standards bodies, we see it's no longer a fight for the right technologies. It's countries voting as a block to get their technologies adopted. Or we have situations like today in China, where the Chinese courts are actually trying to dictate the price of 5G patents around the world, not just the Chinese patents. But so both of those seem very dangerous, because it either causes the worldwide standard to fracture, and that would be bad, or it shifts the dominance to one part of the world, and that would be bad. So I think a lot of this may be outside the FCC's purview, maybe in just in other places, but ultimately the viability of the technology, how well it's produced, how freely available it is very important to the FCC. So how do you guys think about that? How do you work with other agencies? How do you work with Congress to make sure that tilting of the playing field doesn't happen?
Yeah, so even though it's not strictly speaking within our purview, we do work very cooperatively with other agencies, in particular the State Department, which of course represents us in international fora like the ITU, with the Department of Homeland Security, which has the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and with other entities to make sure that we alert them to some of the things we're seeing. And for example, when it comes to 3GPP, we have seen some trends, as you mentioned, where entities are now essentially voting as a block, as a national block. And I think the advantage of the US-based approach, which of course was much more decentralized, much more private sector led in the past, is that you essentially allow all of the best ideas to flow up to the top and reach a consensus based on what's technically accurate or what's technically sound. I think my worry is that when you have a dominant player like the Chinese, led by, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, which is looking to establish dominance in all of these different sectors. I mean, not just telecom, but blockchain, AI, quantum, et cetera. We haven't seen a competitor like that, at least not that I can remember. And how do we respond to that? And so we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to address it. And so I'm glad to say that, as I said, we have a cooperative relationship with my counterparts at other agencies, and I've worked with other countries' agencies, both their FCCs as well as their security agencies and technical agencies, and to make sure they understand the issue as well.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, probably a couple of years ago when us and I think you and others were sort of hinting this could be going the wrong way. I don't think people fully grasp it. I think they get it now. I think so. The fact that you're getting good reception, people, now we're seeing it is great, because there are some very there's some straightforward answers. Just to advocate one position that InterDigital's talked about for years. I don't know why royalty disputes ever go to court. Why aren't they just in arbitration? At the end of the day, it's a contract dispute. We agree to license our technology on fair terms. It's a contract. Let's resolve it like all contract disputes in arbitration, and we're done. And that allows the standard to continue to have that very cooperative spirit, right? Which is really what has driven us to this point. So, just one other question in terms of regulators' role. So, you were talking before, all the different technologies that would allow the FCC to allocate and use spectrum better. right? And or would enable all these different use cases. Do you see the FCC kind of moving closer to the standardization process, meaning trying to influence more where the technology goes versus kind of taking the technology as it comes and says, okay, given you've given me this, we're going to do this. So, because it seems like it used to be more of the latter in the past. Like you got what you got, and then you just figured it out. Versus, hey, what if you did this in the standard? What if you did this in the standard? And that would create all this optionality for spectrum and other things. So, how do you guys think about technology creation at this point?
Yeah, so I think what we've tried to do historically, as you said, is a little bit more hands-off, and we certainly don't want to drive technology in any particular way, while at the same time we want to encourage people to think very broadly. So I guess our way of addressing that has been primarily through flexible use policies, and we auction off the spectrum or we make it available for unlicensed operations. And we say, look, you use it as you will, and so long as you're actually using it, you're not just warehousing it. You could use it for, a Wi-Fi network, an enterprise Wi-Fi network, or you could use it for a bespoke a private LTE network, or you could use it for fixed wireless broadband. And I think that is the way that ultimately we think, well, number one, it's within our legal authority to do that. We don't necessarily have authority to drive technological standards at the FCC. But number two, I think over time is more likely to yield significant benefits, because I think that the private sector is much better positioned to know what is likely to deliver value at the end of the day than the five of us commissioners sitting in the room saying, okay, technology A, that's the way to go, as opposed to technology B. That's historically anyway not been a recipe for success.
And would there be one thing you mentioned when you're speaking this in is what's within your statutory authority and mandate is as this the communication technology just is so pervasive, so important. Are there things within your mandate that you think should actually be changed by Congress to broaden your mandate or change your mandate in some way, because maybe you feel handcuffed right now?
How long do we have? So I mean, look, we're administering the Communications Act of 1934 as amended in most relevant part by the Telecom Act of 96, and that's an eternity in this sector. And so one of the things I've said that Congress could do that would really enable the United States to move the ball forward even further is to make clear that only the FCC can regulate inherently interstate products, essentially IP-based services and products. If I'm in the same room as my wife and we email each other or send a text, even though we're in the same house, the chances are that communication could traverse a state boundary, and that's an inherently interstate activity. And so, to me, at least, the historic way of regulating things at the U.S. is federal, state, local, and then tribal. When you're talking about building a network or delivering 5G services or other advanced services at scale, that quickly bogs down if you have to navigate this regulatory thicket. So what I'd like them to say is we need a consistent level of regulation across the country. The other thing is to augment the FCC's authority over some of the arcane stuff. For example, utility poles, critical element of building a broadband network, but we only have authority over poles that are owned by utilities. We don't have authority over poles owned by municipalities, by states, and railroads. That drives up the cost element for a broadband network dramatically. And that one simple fix could enable us to deliver a lot of value to the American consumer who otherwise might not get the benefit of that broadband network at all.
Right. True. So, and then we go to the last topic before we go to, so we have some questions coming in from the audience. But for those of us who haven't noticed, we're in an election season. Yeah,
you're right. I hadn't noticed that. Yeah.
So you served under two administrations, one Democrat, one Republican, and a lot of things you just talked about in terms of what the FCC does, what it would like to do, what you'd like it to do. How do you think about those issues? Are they Democrat, Republican issues, or are these constituent-driven issues? And so, just as people who run companies like myself, if we have if the Trump has a second term or if Biden gets in, do you sense, would that drive a change, or is this policy almost immune from administration change because maybe people are aligned on where we need to go?
Well, certainly, while hazarding a prediction about the FCC's future is always fraught with peril, I do think that ideally, anyway, the partisan affiliation of whoever is leading the FCC or is overall in control of the FCC shouldn't matter. I mean, if you look at some of the topics we've already discussed, American leadership in 5G, doesn't strike me as a Republican or Democratic issue. That just strikes me as an American issue. Right. Some of the other things that I've held very dear over the last 3.5 years, closing the digital divide and getting rural people access to broadband. That's an American issue. Making more spectrum available for Wi-Fi, that's a nonpartisan issue. Accessibility and making sure that people with disabilities can get this technology as well. And these are not Republican or Democratic issues at all. And I know that there's a few different issues that we handle that may become more political in nature, but ideally, I do hope that whoever is at the FCC will view things not through the prism of their party hat, but more what does John Q. Public think, and how will they benefit if we make a decision that's forward thinking, so that years after we're out of office, they will still benefit from the decisions that we made. And I think that's when the FCC is at its best, when we leave the party labels behind and really focus on the public interest writ large.
Yeah, I agree. I think exactly what you said. This is it's certainly a topic where the U.S. as a group needs to be united, because we want to have technology leadership. I don't think we want to have it in by tilting the playing field in our favor. We want to get there because it was a fair fight and we won, and we only get there when everybody is aligned. And so, and I do feel that way. I mean, I feel similarly about like patent system. I think while we've gone back and forth, I think now we're aligned around a lot of things. There's a lot of things we're not aligned around, other stuff. But I think I'll switch to some questions from the audience. So if you want to pose a question, I think there's a way for you to do that. We have one that's come in, so I'll read that to you. So it says, mobile experts estimate that more than 2 gigahertz of spectrum is underutilized in the bands below 5 gigahertz and could be shared. Can you comment on whether this would be feasible?
So I think that definitely depends on the band. I mean, certainly when it comes to the 2.5 gigahertz band, this is the largest contiguous swath of spectrum in the United States, especially in the Western United States. And it was first allocated for what was then called educational TV service and then educational broadband service in 1963. And decades later, it has not been used. And so that's why we've repurposed it, gave rural tribes a chance to get access to that spectrum, but otherwise we're going to auction it next year. And that's going to be a game changer. Same thing in 3.45 to 3.55. And the Department of Defense has a huge amount of spectrum, not all of which they're necessarily using or that they need to use at all times in all places. And so we're working to make sure that, that we can accommodate whatever national security interests are there, but also make more of that spectrum available for the commercial side. So on the license side, I think many opportunities like that. The other part of it, although maybe it's not strictly speaking relevant to the question, but the L band. I mean, this is a decision that had been sitting around for 17 years, and very controversial, I know, but I'm in this position because we have to make tough decisions, and we made the tough decision to approve that application with conditions because 17 years sitting on that spectrum is just way too long. It's essentially fallow at that point, and so we move forward with a technically sound decision that I think will actually put it to use as opposed to just sitting on a shelf. So here too, I hope that in the future, the FCC will always look aggressively at spectrum to make sure we avoid the premise that led to the question that was presented.
Great. All right. So next question, it's anticipated that 6G is going to require the fusion of cloud and mobile. And when you think about those two environments, the cloud is almost fully deregulated, whereas mobile is highly regulated. So how do you see those two coming together in a more flexible regulatory manner?
Oh, that is, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I mean, certainly we want to encourage that type of vision for 6G, and especially because it's so cloud driven. And, obviously cloud is very competitive in itself. And the last thing we want to do is to impose some of the shackles of the telecom side, which, ironically enough, I think the relatively lighter touch we applied to mobile allowed it to thrive. If we had regulated mobile from the get-go as a Title II service, for example, plain old telephone service, right, I am convinced that mobile never would have taken off. In fact, the first mobile call was presented in 1973 by Marty Cooper, and it took a couple decades for that to really pop. Part of the reason is that the FCC and others were so slow moving and just tried to pigeonhole it as yet another telecom service. So I certainly hope that we would migrate mobile to much more of a lightly regulated service as we do cloud, as opposed to constraining cloud in the way we do mobile. And I think that's ultimately going to be where the future has to be. I mean, we're seeing many more competitors enter the space. The networks themselves are becoming much more competitive with the commoditization of the radio access network. I mean, it's just incomprehensible to me that 20 years from now or 30 years from now, whoever's in my job now will be sitting there thinking, oh, well, okay, we need to fit this, cloud native service into Title III, Section 332. I mean, it's just, that's a kind of lawyer's question that I hope will be relegated to the history books as opposed to being a live issue decades from
now. Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you think about exactly what you said, how the mobile networks are going to change and the virtualization, softwareization, it's more that the environment that sits in the cloud is going to, including the regulatory environment, is going to push down into that. So next question. So AI-based spectrum sharing has recently gained a lot of attention, right? So using AI techniques, wireless devices may be able to learn and make informed spectrum management decisions. Do you foresee AI playing a major role in future systems to enable efficient spectrum sharing?
I absolutely do. Last December, the FCC held a forum on AI and machine learning, focused in particular, of course, on how those technologies are expected to affect the communications sector. And I think here, that is definitely the future. I mean, when you think about the question as you phrased it, monitoring how people are using the network at different times, different places, different intensities. I mean, all of that is just generating data. And so instead of flying blind, if you will, I'm sure network operators, in fact, I know network operators are very interested in incorporating AI so that they can optimize the networks. I mean, ultimately, it's all about how do we serve our consumers better, our customers better. And instead of just saying, okay, here are the 3 options we think are best for you, you're learning from the data that we've got and trying to deliver them a more automated and optimized service is the way of the future. So I think the future is very, very bright here. There's some incredible startups in this space that are working on all these technologies. And here too, I think both the operation of the networks as well as the regulation of the networks will become much more decentralized as a result.
Yeah. So one thing, when you think about AI, for AI to work effectively, it needs access to the data.
Yeah.
Right? And we actually were having this discussion the other day at the company, and not everyone has that information. And to some extent, people that have it are restricted in terms of what they can do with it, right? So, in terms of having the best development environment for the AI tools, it actually doesn't exist today because there are companies that are trying to develop tools without really any visibility into the data.
Right.
And then there's people with the data who really don't know how to develop the tools. So how do you see opening up that data aperture so that lots of people now could access? I appreciate it comes with all kinds of issues too. But it seems like it's almost an essential component to have AI really fulfill its role. Is you got to give people access to the data, right?
Right. That is a fundamental problem. And for better or worse, the FCC doesn't have authority in this particular space. But so I don't have any particular solutions. But I do think that that's one of the things that legislators are going to have to figure out. And Congress, of course, is debating federal privacy legislation or other proposals along those lines. And I think that's going to be critical because obviously we want consumers' privacy to be protected. But when you're talking about access to anonymized data or aggregate data, which is essential to making some of these determinations and leveraging the power of AI and machine learning, I mean, if you don't have the data set, you don't have anything, essentially. Right. So we've got to figure out a way to thread the needle that balances those two interests. And that's impelled in part by the fact that other nations, in particular China, are moving ahead very, very aggressively. And as I understand it anyway, having talked to some folks who invest in Chinese AI companies, so long as you're not threatening the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power, there's no limitation essentially on how you can use the data. And as a result, a lot of the AI companies there are going very, very far ahead. And right. Arguably, they might have a lead in certain sectors. So we might want to think about encouraging that kind of innovation to happen here on our shores, consistent with our expectations of privacy and other consumer protections. Great.
So switching a little bit to a different part of the government. So can you share any thoughts about, there's been a lot of recent press on the Department of Defense wanting to deploy a 5G network and maybe even compete with commercial carriers. So how do you think, what's the FCC's role, or what are your thoughts around the whole defense industry's use of 5G and the military's use of 5G and things like that?
Well, my position on this has been pretty clear for many years, which is that in my view, the market is far better positioned to deliver value to the wireless consumer than a more centrally planned approach. And I think the results speaks for themselves. I mean, the fact that when I came into office in 2012, we had 4% of the US population, but 50% of the world's LTE connections. That's a result of the fact that the FCC didn't pick winners and losers, didn't drive the market structure, allow the private sector to innovate and invest, and consumers were the beneficiaries. And so here too, there might be some academic appeal to a wholesale approach or government-driven approach, but I don't think that's the right one. And so our goal is to use to leverage the power of the market to deliver value. And I think the fact that our model is superior is demonstrated by the fact that just recently, Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson won the Nobel Prize for designing auctions. And so, to us at least, of course, they deserve the credit, but I think the credit also belongs to the very concept that Ronald Coase pioneered back in 1959 through a seminal article called the Federal Communications Commission, which is that when the government steps back and lets the property right be assigned to a license be assigned through market forces, that ultimately is the best way to ensure the highest valued use of that spectrum.
So next question is, are there any lessons learned from CBRS likely to shape spectrum sharing initiatives for beyond 5G and 6G?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think CBRS is unique in the sense that there were certain DoD assets that we needed to protect in certain places. And so, and in addition to that, there was, of course, the three-tiered structure. The military assets get top priority, then the priority access licenses, and then GAA in areas where the first two categories weren't represented. And so that's somewhat unusual. I mean, I wouldn't anticipate, for example, in C-band that we would go down that road, or we won't go down that road. And similarly, in other bands, I don't anticipate that being as much of a factor. But what I do think is going to be much more the norm is a bunch of non-traditional companies starting to participate in these spectrum auctions and take advantage of the fact that they are flexible use licenses that they can use in the mid-band in particular, given the good geographic coverage and capacity, for ways that we can't even envision today. And so that part of it, I'm really excited to see where it goes. So yeah, stay tuned.
So another question on spectrum management. So one participant, is there a trend that individual states may play a bigger role in spectrum management for CBRS, 6 gigahertz and 4.9 gig?
So generally speaking, I would say the answer is no. I mean, I do think that obviously the FCC sets the spectrum policy, but one exception to that would be the 4.9 gigahertz band. And so here, essentially 4.9 gigahertz, 50 megahertz of spectrum, has historically been underused. In fact, only 3.5% of all the potential licensees in the entire nation use this band for public safety, which is what it was originally allocated for. The problem is that, given some of the legal issues and some of the policy issues in terms of public safety, we weren't able to simply reclaim it and then auction it as we would a traditional band. So what we did was a very innovative approach, which is to say that any state can essentially decide how that band is going to be used within that state. They can continue to allow it to be used for public safety and encourage licensees to take advantage of it, or they can go for a dual approach, public safety and commercial, or they can go for full commercial. And so that way we think that that's a much a more nuanced way of attacking the problem. So it's not just a one size fits all directed by the FCC. Every state can decide. But again, that's probably the one-off. 4.9, I don't think is going to be the rule. It's much more of the exception.
Right. So I think I got time for one more question. I think we're sort of wrap up at 3:45 here. So,
okay.
So on 2G and 3G networks, right? And where do you see them going over the next few years to make room for 4G, 5G, and 6G networks?
Oh boy, yeah, that's another one where someone was recently telling me, not within too long. I mean, you're going to have to the FCC, you're going to have to make a decision about requiring the shutdown of 2G networks. There just has to be a date certain, just as there was a date certain for the switch over from analog to digital television back in 2009. And there's 2G and 3G is still in use in this country, and some of the carriers might still want to pursue those services. But I do think that at some point, that becomes the long tail, so to speak, and an increasingly diminishing tail. And so I think the agency is going to have to think about how do we address that to encourage every company to focus their investments on the future as opposed to maintaining the networks of the past.
Right.
Also been the case on the wireline side too, where the last 3 years we've encouraged companies look, just stop investing in copper, which is fading, lower capacity, less resilient, et cetera. Focus on fiber, because every dollar that you spend on copper is by definition one you can't spend on fiber. And generally speaking, that's one of the reasons why we set records in terms of fiber deployment over the last couple of years. So maybe there's a similar story to tell on the 2G, 3G side.
So there was one other question. It was one that we've already addressed, but I'm going to come back to it maybe as a way for you to kind of just for you to end with some concluding remarks, and I have some things to wrap up on, and that's this is the 6G symposium, right? And so when we're looking ahead to 6G, any preliminary thoughts you have on it? I appreciate you guys are sort of neck deep in 5G right now. I get that, but in terms of things that maybe 5G hasn't covered and you'd like to see 6G drive, or maybe back to the other question we were chatting about, which was how you see the FCC's role changing again as we move forward into 6G.
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously been quite busy on 5G, but I think we do have to think about the future as well. And looking to the future, 6G is not that far off in absolute terms. And so we want to make sure that we are thinking in advance. And that's part of the reason why we've opened up some bands to preliminary study. For example, the terahertz bands above 95 gigahertz, for instance, a massive swath, I think 21 gigahertz of that we've opened up for unlicensed, much more for licensed potential use. And so there we want to be thinking about some of the spectrum horizons, things that's literally what we call the bands above 95 gigahertz. And the same thing in terms of the shape of the networks themselves when it comes to 6G. I think the way we've consistently thought about networks is a few macro cell site towers intermittently dotting the landscape, but 6G could be entirely virtualized, and it might look anything like some of the inherent, the legacy networks that we've got. And so we need to make sure we think about tailoring the regulatory burden to the nature of those future-proof networks. And so here too, I mean, it's not inconceivable in 20, 30 years, you might not even need, an FCC or some sort of central interlocutor to figure out, okay, this is who gets access to the spectrum. This is how the network has to be built, et cetera, because everyone will be able to come up with their own type of idea for how to use these assets. So I don't envy the task of InterDigital, the other innovators in this space. It's a wild west out there, and I just hope I'm around to see how it plays out. It's going to be an exciting future, even much more so than the 4G and predecessor technologies we've already seen.
Yeah, so I just sitting here, it's sort of an oddball question, but so when you think about prior spectrum auctions, right, they were very, they could be heated battles, a lot of money being spent to get access to the spectrum, and essentially the government would get this one giant chunk of compensation coming in. Is there a different scheme where it's more of a regular payment stream that would come into the government, because you're basically leasing spectrum from the government? There's a tool by which lots and lots of people can lease the same spectrum because you've got all these tools, and it moves away from this $5 billion this quarter and nothing
right
next quarter, where it's just a constant flow of, it's almost like a fee being paid, right? Is that coming in? So.
Yeah. It could be. It could be in the future that it's essentially like a bike sharing program, right? If you need that spectrum at a particular moment, then you just get it on an as-needed basis. And the same thing with digital advertising. There's of course a spot market for digital ads that you pay in an instant, and you figure out, okay, well, this is the best way to reach the precise people we need. Or it could be even more decentralized than that. I mean, I'm not an expert in blockchain or ledger technologies by any means, but if you had a distributed ledger that was able to document, okay, well, this person has a right to use the spectrum for this period of time in this place. Everyone else necessarily recognizes that because of the integrity of the blockchain. What role is there for a central regulator at that point? And is that a much more efficient, much more cost-effective way to allocate the scarce resource? So, I mean, I'm just glad I have the job for the time being before these technologies make me obsolete. But I do think that there are very exciting and unusual things to think about in the future.
That's great. Well, I wanted to, this has been fantastic, and I wanted to thank you not only for your time here today, but for your leadership and service at the FCC. I mean, this is the second time I've actually gotten to talk with you live. You came to one of our inventor events, and you were incredibly popular. I think you were our favorite speaker over the last decade there. So
wow.
But I think you bring just an incredibly balanced view in what sometimes can seem like a very unbalanced world, right? And I think and I go back to the principles that you have and what you're intending them to do, which is to drive better service, drive growth, and you see it actually happen. So you're not just a man of words, you're a man of action and results. So on behalf of the industry, I want to thank you for everything you do and continue to do. And we'll try not to invent you out of a job.